In 1789, the same year that George Washington was elected President of the United States of America under the new Constitution, France underwent a revolution. We're going to talk about the events of that revolution, but first we're going to look at 3 causes that led up to the actual revolt. The first cause involved social structure. If we look at France back in the Middle Ages, they were broken down into 3 groups of people. These 3 groups were known as estates. Sometimes you'll hear the word estate to mean land. That's not what it's talking about here. It means a group of people. So in the first estate were the clergy. Clergy are people involved in the church. So they thought since they were involved in worshiping and serving God, they were first. Then second were the nobility. These are the rich people who have a say in government. And then third were the commoners. Now if you think back to feudalism, the clergy and nobility would have been generally the lords and even the knights under the social structure, and then commoners would have been the serfs. But as we move into the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, now hundreds of years after the Middle Ages have ended, these commoners include a highly educated middle class known as the bourgeoisie. So there in the third estate, the commoners are not just poor farmers, but people who know about their rights. They're starting to talk about the Enlightenment ideas. In fact, right under the very nose of this medieval social structure, many Enlightenment philosophers had been meeting in salons in Paris and started talking about, wait, people have rights. People have a natural say in government. Because of this, there started to be some unrest. Furthermore, if you talk about money and look at the chart on this slide, what we see right here is the population. 98% of the population were commoners, but only 65% of the land was owned by this 98%. This is basically as though if I brought in a box of 10 cookies and said to divide them between 10 people, if we divided them evenly, each person would get a cookie. In this case, though, it would be asking 9 people to divide 6 of the cookies while giving the other 2 people the other 2 cookies. Now, of course, that's not a clean division with the math there, but you kind of see how unfair that would be. So, in addition to this problem, we see taxation as a major deal, because not just was land unfairly distributed, but the 98% of the population who owned only 65% of the land were the only ones who paid taxes. Nobles, who were the rich people, and clergy were free from taxes. So while the people of Paris are paying exorbitant taxes, do not have enough of the land, and are growing poor because of various financial problems in France during this time, the king and queen were living it up in grand style. Just to give you a kind of a contrast, so France had just helped America win the war against Britain. This is only a few years after the 7 Years' War, where they had been defeated by Britain. So France is bankrupt. They have lost so much money. Then, in addition to that, there were several years of bad harvests, where literally grain was not growing. So the people of France were hungry. They didn't have bread. Meanwhile, Louis XVI, this king right here, was acting as though he was unaware or didn't care. Meanwhile, he marries a very young, so this man's in his 40s, and he marries in her late teens, Marie Antoinette, who is the relative of Maria Theresa. So this is a connection to the Austrian Empire for the French. He marries this young girl who is so interested in having the latest dress, the most beautiful parties, so much interested in her own pleasure and so unaware of what is going on outside that she even on the lands of Versailles has built a large village where she can pretend to be a shepherd when she wants a break from living it as a queen. And this just kind of underscores how she's got all this money to spend on her clothing and her play villages, and yet unaware of what it's really like for the poor people who are only getting poorer in France, and in Paris in particular, during this time. So as the Parisians are growing hungry and it's getting to the summertime, they're looking upon this enormous palace of Versailles, which we've looked at before, which was built by several kings earlier, Louis XIV, under absolutism. And they're feeling the constraints of absolute power. And they're remembering all these Enlightenment principles. And so they start to put pressure on the king, asking him for some changes. So the king invites them to something known as the Estates General. Now, in the Estates General, this was a body that had met since the Middle Ages in France. The Estates General would meet together, and the three estates would all send representatives. So you have clergy members there, and you have nobility there. And then the third estate, the commoners, came out in large numbers. So in May of 1789, they all meet together. The third estate has come with some very clear plans to make taxation apply to everyone and to give more say in government. However, there's a catch. Every time the Estates General votes, the clergy get one vote, and the nobility get one vote, and the third estate gets one vote. So 98% of the population can be outvoted continually by the remaining 2% of the population. Because if the clergy and the nobility all join together and vote, and they only get one vote for the whole estate, and they say, well, the clergy wants this, and the nobility wants this, then the third estate cannot get anything done. And that's exactly what happens in this May meeting of the Estates General. The third estate is continually pushed back. They're continually rejected. So much so that they threaten to make a constitutional government and to change things entirely. Whereupon the king locks them out of the chamber, literally locks the door and doesn't let them in. Having been locked out on June 20th of 1789 by the king from the Estates General, the third estate met in a tennis court where people would generally play tennis and swore an oath together that they would not give up and that they would not stop meeting until they had come up with a government that would clearly represent their rights and interests. This was the beginning of the Revolution. And so the French Revolution begins. We're going to be looking at 4 stages of the Revolution. What we're talking about right now is the very beginning of this first stage, the moderate constitution stage.